Hello guys, welcome to my live streaming. Let me check everything is okay. I am going to start the streaming very soon. If anyone watching, please let me know in the section that everything is okay. Hello guys, welcome to my live streaming. And in today's live, I am going to break B, Mr. Beast, the B movie script reading, and I will also do the same thing and the same process. I will read the whole script and also repeat the B word every time I find the B word, and I will do this to completely live. And I hope you guys like the streaming, and also please don't forget to subscribe my channel. So I am starting now. So B movie is, according to all knows law of evolution, there is no way a bee should be able to fly. Its wings are too small to get its fair little body off the ground. The bee. And when I say bee again, I will read the previous bee. So bee, of course, flies anyway, because bees, bee, don't care what humans think it impossible. Yellow, black, yellow, black, yellow, black, yellow, black. Oh, black and yellow. Let's shake it up a little. Barry, breakfast is ready. Coming. Hang on a second. Hello, Barry. Adam. Can you believe this is happening? I will pick you up. Looking sharp, use the stairs. Your father paid good money for this. Sorry, I am excited. Here's the graduate. We are very proud of you, son. A perfect report card. All be very proud. Ma, I got a thing going here. You got line on your fuse. Oh, that's me. Web to us. You will be in a row 118000. Bye. Barry, I told you, stop playing in the house. Hey Adam. Hey Barry. Is that Fizzle a little special day of graduation? Never thought I would make it. There are 3 days grade school, 3 days high school. Those are okay. The 3 days college. I am glad I took a day in. It's 6 around the hive. You did come back different. Hi Barry. I try growing a mustache. Looks good. Yeah, about Frankie. Yeah. You going to the funeral? No, I am not going. Everybody knows. Sting someone, you die. Don't waste it on a squirrel. Sase hothead. I guess he could have just gotten out of the way. I love his incorporating as amusement park into our days. That's why we don't need vacation. Boy, quite a bit of pomp under the circumstance. Well, Adam, today we are men. We are B, B, B man, amen. Halajo. Students, faculty, disgusting bees. B, B. Please welcome Dean Bujoel. Welcome new high IT graduate class of 9:15. That's concludes our ceremonies and begins our careers and Honest industries. Will we pick our job today? I heard it's just orientation. Heads up, here we go. Keep your hands and antennas inside the tram all the times. Wonder what it will be like. A little scary. Welcome to Honix, a division of Honsko and a part of the Honsko group. This is it. Wow, wow. We know that you as a B, B, B have worked your whole life to get to the point where you can work for your whole life. Honey begins with our valiant pollen jacks bring the nectar to the hive. Our top secret formula is automatically color corrected since abstract and bubble turned into this shooting sweet syrup with its disconnective golden glows you know as honey. That girl was hot. She is my cousin. She is, yes, you are all cousin. Right, you are right. At Honex, we constantly strive to improve every aspect of B, B, the B existence. Those B's, B, 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 B are stress testing a new helmet technology. What do you think he makes? Not enough. Here we have our latest achievement, the kernel man. What does that do? Octaves that little thread of honey that hangs after you put it save us millions. Can you work on the kernel? Of course, the most B, 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 the B. Jobs are small ones, but Biz knows that every small job, if it's done well, mean a lot. But choose carefully, because you will stay in the job you pick for the rest of your life, the same job the rest of your life. I didn't know that. That's the difference. You will be happy to know that B's B B B B B B the B as spices haven't had one day off in 27 million years, so you will just work us to death. You will sure try. Wow, that's below my mind. What is the difference? How can you say that? One job forever. That's an insane choice to have to make. I am I'm relieved now. We only have to make one decision in life. But Adam, how could they never had have told us that? Why would you question anything? We are bees. So B B B and B. We're the most powerful perfectly functioning society on the earth. You ever think maybe things work a little too well here? Like what? I give me one example. I don't know, but you know what I am talking about. Please clear the gate. Royal nectar forts on the approach. Wait a second. Check it out. Actually, they give a mistake. Maybe it was C. I get all the mistake. Check it out. Hey, those are the pollen jocks. Wow, I have never seen them in those clothes. Uh, they know what it's like outside the hive. Yeah, but some don't come back. Hey, jocks. Hi, jocks. You guys did great. You are monsters. You are sky Frex. I love it. I love it. I wonder where they were. I don't know. They are just not planted outside the hive, flying. Who knows? They are doing who knows what. You can't just decide to be pollen jocks. You have to be prepared for that, right? Look, that's more pollen that you and I will see in the lifetime. It's just a status symbol. Bees. Oh, it's so good. B B B B B B B B B B B B. This makes too much of it. Perhaps unless you are wearing it and ladies see you wearing it. Those ladies aren't they our cousins too? Distance, distance. Look at those two. Couple of high berries. Let's have fun with them. I must be. It must be dangerous being a pollen jack. Yeah, once Bear pinned me against the mushroom. He had a bow on his throat, and with the others he was slapping me. Oh, I never thought I would knock him out. What are you doing during this? Trying to alert the authorities. I can autograph that. A little gusty out there today, wasn't it? Commanders? Commanders. Yeah, gusty. We are hitting a sunflower patch 6 miles from here tomorrow. 6 miles, huh? Very a puddle jump for us, but maybe you are not up for it. Maybe I am. You are not. We are going 0900 at J Gate. What do you think, Buji boys? Are you B enough? So B B B B B B B B B B B B B. I might be. It all depends on what 0900 means. Hey Honex, Dad, you surprised me. You decide what you are interested in. Well, there is a lot of choices, but you only get one. Do you ever get bored doing the same job every day? Son, let me tell you about starting. Stirring. You grab that stick and you just move it around and you stir it around. You get yourself into a rhythm. It's a beautiful thing. You know that the more I think about it, maybe the honey field just isn't right for me. You are thinking of what? Making balloon animals? That's a bad job for guy with a strainer. Janet, your son's not sure he wants to go into honey. Barry, you are so funny sometimes. I am not trying to be funny. You are not funny. You are going into honey. Our son, the stirrer. You are gonna be a stirrer and no one's listening to me. Wait till you see the stick I have. I could say anything right now. I am going to get an ant tattoo. Let's open some honey and celebrate. Maybe I will price my throat, save my Anthony. Shake up with the grasshopper, get a gold tooth, and call everybody dog. I am so proud. We are starting work today. Today is the day. Today's the day. Come on, all the good jobs will be gone. Yeah, right. Pollen counting is turn B. So B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B. So B powering star font text hair removal. Is it still available? Hang on, two left. One of them yours. Congratulations. Step to the side. Wait. What you get? Picking crowd out stare. Wow. Couple of newbies. Yes, sir. Our first day. We are ready. Make your choice. Make your choice. You want to go fast? No, you go. Of my. What's available? Restroom attendance open. Not for the reason you think. Any chance of getting the Cattleman? Sure, you are on. I'm sorry, the Cattleman just closed out. Wax Monk is always open. The Cattleman opened up again. What's happened? A bee died. So I need to read the B again. So B, bees, 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 B, bees, B, bees, B, and B. Abby died makes an opening. See his head, another head one. Deadly dead fight. Two more deads. Dead from the neck up. Dead from the neck down. That's life. Oh, that's so hard. Hitting, cooling, stun B, puring, staring, humming. Inspector number 7. Line coordinators, stripping, supervisor, mine oiling. Barry, what do you think I should? Barry? Barry? Alright, we have got the sunflowers patch in Garden 9. What happened to you? Where are you? I am going out. Out? Out where? Out there. Oh no, I have to. Before I go to work for the rest of my life. You are gonna die. You are crazy. Hello? Another call coming. If anyone's falling brave, there's Korean Dale on the 83, 83rd. That gets their roses today. Hey guys, look at that. Isn't that the kid we saw yesterday? Hold it, son. Flight decks restrict. It's okay, we're gonna take him up. Really feeling lucky, are you? Sign here. Here, just initiate that. Thank you. Okay, you got a rain advisor today. And as you know, B, 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 bees, 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 B, 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 bees, B, bees, B, B. It's so tough. Actually, Mr. Beast did a great job. And as you know, all bees cannot fly in the rain, so be careful as always. Watch your brooms. Honky stick dogs, birds, bears, and bears. And also, I got a couple of reports of the root bears, and this is not actually bears. Bear being proud on us. Morphe, is it a home because of its bubbling like a cicada? That's awful. And remember, for your rookies, B, B's, B, 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 B's, 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 B, B, B's, B, B's, B, B. Law number one: absolutely no talking to humans. Alright. Lance positions. Booze, 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 booze. Black and yellow. Hello. You ready for this hot shot? Yeah, yeah. Bring it on. Wine check. Antenna check. Net clear pack check. Wing check. Strength check. Scared out of my shot check. Okay, ladies. Let's move it on. Proud those pentiness, you strap them, stalkers. All of you, drain those flowers. Oh, I am out. I can't believe I am out. So blue. I feel so fast and free. Box kite. Wow, flowers. This is blue letters. We have rose visual. Bring it around 30 degrees and hold. Rose. 30 degrees roger, bringing it around. Stand to the side. Kid, it just go a bit of a kick. That's one nectar collector. Even see pollution up close. No, sir. I pick up some pollen here, sprinkling it over here. Maybe a dash over the tree. This tree. A piece on that one. See that it's a little bit of magic. That's amazing. Why do we do that? That's pollen power. More pollen, more flower, more nectar, more honey for us. Cool. They did mistake every see here. I don't know what is this. I am picking up a lot of bright yellow. Could you please, guys, don't we need those? Copy that visual. Wait, one of those flowers seems to be on the move. Say again, you are reporting a moving flower. Affirmative. That was on the line. This is the coolest. What is it? I don't know, but I am loving this color. It smells good. Not like flowers, but it's like it. Yeah, Fiji. Chemically. Carefully, guys. It's a little gabbery. My sweet lord of bees. So I can get a bee. So bees. Bee. Bees. Bees. Bee. 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 Bees, 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 bee, bees, bee, bee, bees, bee, bees, bee, and bee. Candy brand, get up there. Problem, guys. This could be bad. Affirmatively, very close. Gonna hurt. Ma'am's little boy, mama's little boys. You are way out of the position. Rookie, coming in at you like a missiles. Help me. I don't think those are flowers. Should we tell him? I think he knows. What is this? match points. You can start picking up honey because you are about to eat it. Yo, sir, gross. Those are bee in the car. So here I can be. So bees, bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, 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 bee, bees, bee, bee, and bees, bee, bees, bee, and bee. So I might feel pain on my neck already. I just maybe finished 10% of this passage, I think. There is a bee in the car. We did like this. Do something. I'm driving. Hey bee. Again the bee. Oh my god. Bee. Bees. Bee. Bee. Bees. Bee. 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 Bees. 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 Bee. 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 Bees. Bee. Bees. Bee. 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 He is back there. You going to sting me? Nobody move. If you don't move, he won't sting you. Freeze. He blinked. Spray him, Gangiri. What are you doing? Wow, the tension level out here is unbelievable. I got I gotta get him. Can't fly in the rain, can't fly in the rain, can't fly in the rain. Mayday, mayday. Be going down. Second B. B. Bees. Bees. B. 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 Bees. 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 B. B. Bees. B. Ken, could you close the window, please? Ken, could you close the window, please? Check out my new resume. I made it into a fold out brochures. You see, folds out. Oh no, more humans. I don't need this. What was that? Maybe this time, this drafts. That is diabolical. It's fantastic. It's got all my special skills, even my top 10 favorite movies. What's the number one? Star Wars? No, no, I don't go for that kind of stuff. No wonder you should talk to them. They are out of their minds. So what I live in the job interview. They are Ferguson can't believe what I say. There's the sun. Maybe that is the way out. I don't remember the sun having a big 75 on it. I predicted global warming. I could feel it getting hotter. At first, I thought it was just for me. It was just me. Wait, stop. B. So I need to read the B again. B. Bees. B. Bees. B. 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 Bees. Bees. B. B. Stand back. Those are winter boars. Wait, don't kill him. I am allergic to them. This thing could kill me. Why does his life have less value than yours? Why does his life have any less value than mine? Is that your statement? I'm just saying all life has value. You don't know what is capable of feeling. My brothers, there you go, little guy. I'm not scared of him. It's an allergic thing. Put that on your resume, brothers. My whole face could puff up. Make it one of your special skill. Knocking someone out is also a special skill. Right by Venus, thanks. Venus, next week, yogurt night. Sure, can you know whatever. You could put a carb chips on there. Bye. Supposed to be less calories. Bye. I got to say something. She saved my life. I got to say something. Alright, here it goes. Nah. What would I say? I could really get in trouble. It's a beast law. You are not supposed to talk to a human. So I got a B again, and I need to read the previous B and B and B B B B's B B B B B B B B's 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 B B B B B B B B B. Okay. We're supposed to not to supposed to talk to a human. I can't believe I am going to. I am doing this. I have got to. You. Oh, you can't do it. Come on. No. Yes. No. Do it. I can't. You should. How should I start it? You like jazz? No, that's not good. Here's she comes. Speak, you fool. Hi. I am sorry. You are talking. Yes, I know. You are talking. I'm I'm so sorry. No, it's the okay, it's fine. I know I am dreaming, but I don't recall going to bed. Well, I am sure this is very disconcerting. This is a bit of surprise to me. I mean, you are a bee. Okay, I got the B again. And B, 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 bees, B, B, bees, B, 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 bees, 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 bee, bees, bee, bee, bees, bee, bees, bee, bee. Okay, maybe not too far. So here I was. I am, and I am not supposed to be doing this. But they are all trying to kill me, and if I wasn't for you, I had to thank you. It's just how I was raised. That was a little weird. I am talking with a bee. Yeah. Also, now I'm here. No, B, B, bees, B, 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 bees, B, B, bees, B, 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 bees, 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 B, bees, B, B, bees, B, bees, B, B, Bees, B and B. So I finished the reading this all of the bees. Now I going back where I start finished. Oh yeah. Oh no, more bees. I'm talking to a bee. So again from here. B bees, B B B B B bees, B bees, bees, B B B bees. We are bees, 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 B bees, B B bees, B bees, B and B. Maybe I finished about 30%. Yes. And the bee is talking to me. Again B. So B B B B B B B B bees, B B bees, B B B B bees, 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 B bees, bees, B B bees, B bees, B B. Okay. I just want to say I am grateful. I will leave now. Wait, how did you learn to do that? What? The talking things. Same way you did, I goes. Mama, dada, honey, you pick it up. That's very funny, yeah. Bees are funny. So B, 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 bees, B, 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 bees, 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 B, bees, B, B, bees, B, bees, B, B. If we don't laugh, we would cry with that we have to deal with anyway. Can I get you something? Like what? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Coffee? I don't want to put you out. It's not trouble. I'm taking 2 minutes. It's just coffee. I hate to impose. Don't be ridiculous. Actually, I would love a cup. Hey, you want rum cake? Shouldn't I shouldn't have some? No, I can't. Come on. I'm trying to lose a couple of micrograms. Where those strips don't help. You look great. I don't know if you know anything about the fashion. Are you alright? No. Here's making the tie in the cab as they are flying up Madison. He finally gets there. He runs up in the step into the church. His wedding is on, and he says, "Watermelon." I thought you said get a melon. Why would I marry a watermelon? Is that a bee joke? So I can get a bee. Bees, B, 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 bees, B, B, bees, B, 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 bees, 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 B, 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 bees, B, Bees, bee, bee. That's the kind of stuff we do. Yeah, different. So what you are gonna do, Barry, about work? I don't know. I want to do my part for the hype, but I can't do it in that way they want. I know how you feel. You do, sure. My parents want me to be a lawyer or a doctor, but I want to be a florist. Really? Oh, my interest is flower. Oh, really? My only interest is flower. Our new queen has just elected with the same campaign slogan. Anyway, if you look, there is my hive right there. See it? You are in sheep meadow. Yes, I am right. Of the travel pond. No way. I know that are I lost a ring in there once. So why do girls put rings on their toys? Why not? It's like putting a hat on their knee. Maybe I will try that. You alright, Mama? Oh, yeah, fine. Just having 2 cups of coffee. Anyway, this had been great. This is not been, this been. Thanks for the coffee. Yeah, it's no trouble. Sorry, I couldn't finish it if I had uh, be up there the rest of my life. Are you? Can I take a piece of this with me? Sure, here have come. Thanks. Yeah. All right. Well, then I goes. You will see you. I will see you around or not. Okay, very and thank you so much again for before. Oh, that was nothing. Well, you nothing. But anyway, this can't possibly work. He's all set to go. We may well will try. Okay, they pull the short. Sound amazing. It was amazing. It was the circus happiness moment, scariest happiest moment of my life. Humans, I can't believe you are with humans. Giant scare humans. What were they like? Huge and crazy. They talk crazy. They eat crazy giant things. They drive crazy. Do they try and kill you like on TV? Some of them, but some of them don't. How do you get back, Puddle? Puddle. You did it, and I am glad. I am glad you saw whatever you wanted to see. You had experience. Now you can pick out your job and be normal. Well, well, well. I met someone. You did. Was she Billish? So I got another B. So this is not B. The B's, B's, B, 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 B's, B, B's, B, 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 B's, 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 B, B's, B, B, B's, B, B's, B's, B, B. Okay. A WhatsApp, your parents will kill you. No, 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 not a WhatsApp. Spider? I'm not attached to spiders. I know it's the honest things with the 8 legs and all. I can get it by that face. So who is she? She is human. No, no, That is a B law. So I got the B again. B, B, B's. I'm feeling so pain in my neck. So B, 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 B's, B, B's, B, 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 B's, 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 B, B's, B, B, B's, B, B's, B, B. So I need to put button of my phone because I was calling. Okay. Maybe I just finished 40% or maybe 30%, 35%. I can be. You wouldn't break a B law. Again the B. So B, 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 B's, B, 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 B's, B, 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 B's, 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 B, 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 and B's, B, B. Her name's Venus. Oh boy, she is so nice, and she is a florist. Oh no, you are dating a human florist. You are. We are not dating. We are flying outside the hive, talking to humans that attack our home with the power busters and M18s. 1-8 is a sick of dynamite. She saved my life and she understands me. This is over. Eat that. This is not over. What was that? They call it a comb. It was so stratigraphy, and that's not what they eat. That's what the falls of the eyes. Falls of what they eat. You know what? Wannaborn is no. It's bread and cinnamon and foresting. They heat it up. Sit down. Really hot. Listen to me. We are not them. We are us. They are us, and there's them. Yes, but who can deny the heart? Is that young ring? There is no young ring. Stop leaning. Listen to me. So I can close this actually. You have got a start thinking. B. B. So B, B, B. This B, B's, B, 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 B's, B B B's B B B B B's 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 B B B B B's B B's B. Okay, now my friends thinking B. B B. Oh my God, then it finished. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B's B's B B's 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 B B B B and B B B. So again B. Thinking B. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's 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 B B's B B B's B B's B B. Again the B. Thinking B. Again B B B B B B B's B B's B's B B B B B B B B's B B's B's B B B B B's 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 B B oh B's B B's B B. And the thinking B. Oh my God, how many times they said this one? B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's 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 B B's B B B's B B's B B. So I am here. Next B. Thinking B. B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B's B B's B's B B B bees, 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 bee, bees, bee, bee, bees, 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 bee, bee. Another bee. Thinking bee. Bee, 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 bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, 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 bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, bee. Okay, I have another more bee here. Yes, this bee last one from here. Thinking bee, 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 bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, 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 bee, 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 bees, bee, bees, bee, bee. Okay, now there he is. He's in the pool. You know what your problem is, Barry? I got starting thinking bee. Again bee. Bee, 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 bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, 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 bees, 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 bee, 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 bees, bee, bees, bee, bee. How much longer will this go on? It's been 3 days. Why aren't you working? I have got a lot of big life decision to think about. Bees, bee. Guys, wait a moment, please. I'm just doing a little. What life? Wow, you have no life. You have no jobs. You are barely a B. So I get another B. So I need to order B, 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 B's, B, B, B's, B, 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 B's, 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 B, B, B's, B, B, B's, B, B's, B, B. Okay, let us come to this point. God, guys, please do help me to finish this. Stay with me. I'm sure no one is watching, but I will do this, and I will trying to do all the things that did by Mr. Beast, and I really love Mr. Beast what he did. Would it kill you to make a little money? Very come out. Your father's talking to you. Martin, would you talk to him? Barely. I am talking to you. You coming? Yeah, got everything all set. Go ahead. I will catch up. Don't be too long. What's this, Venus? You are still here. You told you not to yell at him. He doesn't respond to yelling. Then why yell at me? Because you don't listen. I'm not listening to this. Sorry, I have got to go. Where are you going? I'm meeting a friend. A girl. Is she? Is is this why you can't decide? Bye. I just hope she is Bilish. So I got another B. B, 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 B's, B, B, B's, B, 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 B's, 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 B, B's, B, B, B's, B, B's, B, B. Okay. Think I finished about 40%. They have a huge parade of flowers every year in Pasadena. To be in the tournament of the rose, that's every florist dreams. Up on a florist surrounded by flowers, crowded, cheering a tournament. Do the roses complete in the authentic events? No, alright, I have got one. How come you don't fly everywhere? It's existing. Why don't you running everywhere? It's faster. Yeah, okay, I see. Alright, your turn. Tivo, you can just freeze live TV. That's is insane. You don't have that. You have here. Hippo, but is distance? It's horrible, horrible disease. Oh my dumb beast. So I get the B again. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees, b b b b b b b b bees, b b bees, b b b b bees, bees bees bees, b b b b bees, b bees, b b. Okay, not this too much. You must want to string all those jerks. We try not to string. It's just usual fatal for us. So you have to watch your temper very carefully. You kicked a wall. Take a wall. Write an angry letters and throw it out. Work through its likes and emotion. Anger, jealousy, lust. Oh my goodness, are you okay? Yeah. What is wrong with you? It's a bug. He's not bothering anybody. Get out of here, you are creep. What was that? A pig and save across? Yeah, it was. How did you know? You. It feels like about 10 pages. 75 is pretty much our limit. You have really got that down to a science. I lost a cousin in Italian Bologna, I will bet. What in the name? You might Hercules is this? How did this get there? Get here? I would be golden blue jump. So I get another B. So B is B, B B B B B B B B B B B B B B is B B is B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B's B B's 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 B B's B B B's B B's B B B's B B. Golden Blossom, a Ray Lloyd private selector. Is he that actor? I never heard of him. Why is this here? The people we at it. You don't have enough food for your own. Well, yes. How do you get it? Bees make it. Again, B. So B bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees 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 B bees B B B bees B bees B B. I know who make it, and it's hard to make it. There's a heating, cooling, stirring. You need a whole caramel thing. It's organic. It's our organic. It is very honey berry. Just what? Bees don't know about this. So here again bees. So bees bee 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 bees bee 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 bees bees bee bee bees bees bee 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 bees bee bees bee bee bees bee bees bee bee. This is sterling, a lot of sterling. You have taken our homes, school, hospitals. This is all we have, and it's on sale. I am getting to the bottom of this. I am getting to the bottom of all of this. Hey Hector, you almost done. Almost where he is here. I sense it. Well, I goes. I will go home now, and I just leave this nice honey out with no one around. You are bastard, box boy. I know I heard something, so you can talk. I can talk, and now you will start talking. Where are you getting this sweet stuff? How's your supplier? I don't understand. I thought we were friends. The last thing we want to do is upset bees. So I'm gonna go bees. So bees bee bee bees 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 bee 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 bees bee bees bee bee bees. Okay. You are too late. It's hour now. Yeah, you, sir. You have crossed the wrong sword. You, sir. You will be launched from my ego now. Ego Nichio. Where is the honey coming from? Tell me where. Honey farms. It comes from honey farms. Crazy person. What terrible things has happened here? And then those faces, they never knew what hit them, and now you are on the road to nowhere. Just keep stealing. What? You are not dead? No, I don't. I do. I look dead. They will whip me anything. That's movies where you headed to honey farms. I'm not into something huge here. I'm going to Alaska. Moods, blood, crazy stuff blows your head off. I'm going to Tacoma, and you are really dead. And the guys, I need to check if the live is. working correctly or not. Alright, oh no, what is that? Oh no, a weeper, triple blade, jump on it. It's your only chance, B. So I get the B again. Just a moment, I need to check if the live is working or not. Oh, okay, everything is okay. Sorry for the boring. So I got the B again. I need to be the previous B again. B's, B, B's, B, 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 Bean, B, B's, B, 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 B's, B, B, B's, B, 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 B's, 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 B, B's, B, 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 B's, B, B. Okay, almost 50% to go, I think. Why does everything have to be so doggone clean? How much do you people need to say? Open your eyes, stick your head out of the window from the NPR news in Washington. I am Oral Castle, but don't kill no more bugs. B. So B, B's, 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 B, B's, B, 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 Bean, B, B's, B, 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 B's, B, B, B's, B, 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 B's, 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 B, B's, B, 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 B's, B, B's, B, B. Most blood guy. You hear something like what? Like Teeny screaming. Turn off the radio. What's up, B boy? Again the B. B, B, B's, B, 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 B's, B, 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 B's, B, 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 B's, B bear, bees, B B B B bees, 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 B bees, B B bees, B bees, B B. Okay. Hey blood, just a row of honey jars as far as the eye could see. Wow. I assume whatever these drugs goes is where they are getting it. I mean that honey bars. Bees hang tight. So again the B. B B B bees, bees, B B bees, bees, B B B B B B B B B B bean, B B B B B B B B B B B bees, B bear, bees, B B B B bees, B B bees, bees, B B bees, B bees, B bees, B B. I think almost 50% done. We're all jammed in. It's a close community, not us, man. We are on our own. We on our own. Every mosquito on his own. What if you get in trouble? You is mosquito. You are in trouble. Nobody likes us. They just smacked. See the mosquito smack smack. At least you are out of the world. You must meet girls. Mosquito girls try to trade up, get with a moth dragonfly. Mosquito girl don't want no mosquito. You got to be kidding me. Mosquito hood about to leave the building so long been. Hey guys, so long B. I got new B here. So bees B B B bees 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 B bees B B B B B B B B B B B B bean B bees B B B B B B B B B bees B B bees bees B B B bees 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 B B B B bees B bees B B. Hey guys, most blurred. I know I would cast you all down here. Did you bring your crazy straw? We throw it in the jars, slap a label on it, and it's pretty much pure profit. What is this place? A bee's got a brain, so I got another bee. B B B B B bees 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 B bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B bean B bees B B B B B B B B bees. B bees. B B B B bees bees B bees B bees B bees bees B bees B B. The size of all pinhead. There are pinheads. Pinhead. Oh, check out this new smoker. Oh, sweet. That's the one you want. The Thomas 3000 smoker, 90 puffs a minute and semi-automatic 2 is nicotine. All the tar. A couple beats you of these knocks them right out. They make the honey and we make the honey. They make the honey and make the money. They make the honey and we make the money. Oh my, what's going on? Are you okay? Yeah, it doesn't last too long. Do you know you are in a fake hive with the fake walls? Our queen was moved here. We had no choice. This is our queen. This is a man in woman's clothes. That's a man in woman clothes. That's a dark queen. Oh, what is this? Oh no, there's hundreds of them. Bee honey. Oh, bees, bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, 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 bees, bees, bee, 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 bees, bees. Okay. Our honey is bleeding, blazingly stolen on a massive scale. This is the worse than everything bears have done. I intend to do something. Oh, berry shop. Who told you humans are talking our honey? That's a rumor. Does those look like homers? That's a conspiracy theory. Those are obviously doctorate photos. How did you get mixed up with this? He's been talking to humans. What talking? This not been this been. What talking to humans? He has a human girlfriend and they make out. Make out very? We do not. You wish you could. The sides are you on? The bees. So bees bees bee bees bee 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 B B B B bees 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 B bees B B bees B bees B B. Okay, I dated a cricket once in San Antonio. Those crazy legs keep me up all night. Barry, this is what you want to do with your life? I want to do it for all our lives. Nobody works harder than bees. Bees, bee, bees, bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, 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 bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, bee, bees, bees, bee, bees, bees, bee, bee, bees, bee, bees, bee, bee. I think 50% have been finished of this script. That I remember you coming home so overworked. Your heads are still stirring. You couldn't stop. I remember that. What right to do? What right do they have to our honey? We live on two cups a year. We live on 2 cups a year. They put it in our lip blame for no reason whatsoever. Even if it's true, what can one be do? This is so hard, guys. So bees, B, bees, B, bees, bees, B, bees, B, 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 B is B, B. Okay. Sting them where it's really hurts. In the face, the eye. That would hurt. No. Up the nose, that's a killer. There is only one place you can't sting the humans. One place where it matters. The hive at 5. The hive's only 4 hour action. News source. No more bees, bee breads. No more bee breads. So I can be bees, bees, bee, bees, bee, bees, bee, bee, bees, bees, bee, bees, bee, bees, bee, 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 B B B B B B B B B B B bees B B bees B B B B bees bees B B B bees B B bees B bees B B. With Bob Bubble at the anchor decks, weather is storm string, sports win Bazar Lavi, and the Genitia Hong. Good evening, I am Bob Bubble, and I am the Genitia Hong. A tri country bees Barry Benson, so I can the B. B B B's B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B's 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 B B's B B B's B B's B B. Barry Benson intends to show the human race for stealing our honey, packing it in proofling from the illegally. Tomorrow night's Bees Larry King. Tomorrow night's on Bees Larry King. So again the B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B's 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 B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B then B B's B B B B B B B B B B's B B B's B B B B B's 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 B B B B's B B B B. It's 11:05. So I just finished about 50% of this. I'm not sure because in China the in our hostel current goes out after 12 at night, so if the live streaming will be on or off I'm confused. We have three of our forums queens here in our studio discussing their new books, classy ladies our out this week in Hong Kong. Tonight we are talking to the Barry Benson. Did you ever think I am a kid from the hive? You can't do this. Bees have never been afraid. So now the B again. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B's B B B B B's B B. Okay, I need to do it fast. I'm confused of this. What about the B Columbus? To change the world. What about B Columbus? B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B's B B B B B B B B B B B B. Okay, I was here. B Gandhi. Bezers. So again, B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Where I'm from, I would never such humans who are thinking of the Starbucks or candy stores. How old are you? And the B community. B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B's B B is supporting the in this case who is will be the trial of those B century. So B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B's B B. You know they have the Lady King and the human world too. It's a common name. Next week he looks like you and has shown and suspenders and colored dots next to his glasses course and the bottoms of the ghost even thought you just heard him. Bear week next week. You are scared Harry and Harry lived always leans forward pointing shoulders squaring the eyes very James is intense you attacks the point of the weakness. It was my grandmother. Ken she was 81 honey. Her backyard is a joke. I'm not gonna take advantage of that. Quiet place actually work going on here. Is that the same bee? So B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B Bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B bees bees B B bees B bees 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 B bees B bees bees B bees B B. I'm helping. Yes, it is. I'm helping him sue the human race. Hello, hello, bee. Oh my God, again bee. How many bees I have down? So many yet. B B B B B. B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees bees B B bees B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B B B B B B B B B B B this bees B B B B B B B bees bees B B B B B B B B B B. This is can yeah, I remember your Timberland size 10 and a half Bitman soul, I believe. Why does he talk again? Listen, you better go, cause you are really busy working. But it's our yogurt night. Bye bye. Why is yogurt night so difficult? You poor thing. You two have been at this for 4 hours. Yes, and Adam here has been a huge help. This not be this been just foresting how many sugars. Just one. I try not to use the competition. So why are you helping me? Bees have good qualities. So this B is B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B's B B B B Bees, bees, bee, 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 bee. Thomas. And it takes me mind of the shop, and instead of the flowers people are giving a balance because now those are the great if you are there. The artificial flowers, oh those does get my uh, if tonic years me to bend distance just from the politicians. Bees must have hate those fake things. I am playing so sleepy. At this moment, bees, bees, bee, bees, bee, bees, 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 bee, bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, bee, bees, bees, bee, bees, bee. Can I eat something? I don't know. I'm not sure. Nothing worse than a daffodil. That's a hard work done. Maybe this could make up for the little bit. This lost sweet pretty big deal. I go sure. You want to go through with it? Am I sure? When I'm done with the humans, they won't be able to say, "Honey, I am home," without paying the royalty. It's a incredible scene here in downtown Manhattan where the world anxiously waits because for the first time of historical we will hear for ourselves if a honeybee can actually speak. Bees bee 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 bees golden blossom. Just a moment. Check my phone for some reason. Oh, let me check is the live is going or not. I'm not sure because the net connection is not so good here. Yeah, we are on live still. The bees, bee, 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 bees, bees, bee, bee, bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, bee. Okay, now the next line. What have we gotten into here, Barry? It's pretty big, isn't it? I can't believe how many humans don't work during the day. You think billion dollars multinational foods companies have good lawyers? Everybody needs to stay behind the barricade. What's the matter? You don't know. I just got a chill. Well, if isn't the B team. So B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B Bees B B Bees B B Bees B Bees B B. You boys work on this, alright. The Honorable Judge Bam, the President, alright. The case number 4475, Superior Court of the Newark, Barry B. Benson B. History. B B B's B's B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B's B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B's. Is now in session, Mr. Montgomery. You are responding to the five food companies collectively and prevail privilege. Mr. Benson, you are responding all the bees of the world. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B and B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B's B. It's just I am so thirsty now, but can't. It's silence. So B's and B B's B B B B B's B B. What the matter? It's come this too much, but this is going too slow. I'm kidding. Yes, Your Honor. You are ready to proceed, Mr. Montego. Your opening statement, please. Ladies and gentlemen of the judge, my grandmother was a simple woman born in the farm. She believed it was a man's driven right to benefit from the brunt of nature God put before us. If we live in the topsy-turvy world Mr. Benson imagines, just think of what would it means. I would have to negotiate with the silkworm for the elasticity in my breeches talking bee. So bees b bees b b bees bees b b b b bees bees b. How do we know this isn't some sort of holographic motion picture captured Hollywood website? And they could be using laser pumps, robotics, benders, and organ for all we know. He could be on the steroids. Mr. Benson, ladies and gentlemen, there is no trickery here. I'm just an ordinary bee. Honey, pretty important to me. So, and it's 11:30. Oh my god. B B is B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B's B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B's B's B B's B B B B B B B. Honey is pretty important to me. It's important to all bees. We invented it. Okay. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. We invented it, we make it, and we protect it with our lives. Unfortunately, there are some people in this room who is think they can take it from us because they are really we are little guys. I'm hoping that after this is all over, you will see how you by taking our honey is not only take everything we have, but everything we are. I wish he had dressed like that and all the time so nice. Call your first witness. So Mr. Carlos the honey of the first big company you have. I suppose so. I see you also on honeyborn and honeyron. Yes, they are provide beekeepers for our farmers. So I got another bee. Those are not beekeepers, and beekeepers I find that to be a very disgusting teams. I don't be amazing your import any bee fresh car do you? So and the B. Oh, B B's B B B B B B B B's B B B's B B B B B's B's B B's B's B B B B B B B B. No, I couldn't hear you. No, no, because you didn't freebase. You bees again. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees 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 B bees bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B B B B bees B B bees B bees bees B B B B B B B bees B B. You keep bees bees. You keep bees. Not only that. The keeper read all the bees. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. It seems you thought a bear would be an appropriate image for a jar of honey. There are very lovely creators, yogi bears, fuzzy bears, and build a bear. You might like this bear skills bees. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B beats. It's easy to read all the script at it, but when you're repeating the beats every time, it's getting too much hard to do this actually. How would you like this head crashing on through the living room, biting into the cars, spurting down the spinning out the trophy loss? Okay, that's enough. Take him away. So, Mr. Strength, you're being here. Your name is introduce me. Where I have heard it before. I was with a band called the Police. But you have never been a police officer, have you? No, I haven't. No, you haven't. No, you haven't. And so here we have yet another example of a bee culture casually. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Just a moment, guys. Hold on. B B B B B B B B B B B B. What's going on? Are you okay? No, no, not the B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. B B B B B B B B B. For nothing more than a particular about Eastern name of please. Have you ever been to Strangle on Mr. Sting? Because I'm feeling a little strong is telling. Oh, no, should I say Mr. Gong Samar? That's not the real name. You idiots. You learn first. Be better. Congratulations on your Emmy win for the Ghost Spot appeared in 2005. Thank you, thank you. I see from your resume that you are a devilish handsome with a cunning, today. That's ready to blow. I enjoy what I do. Is that a crime? Not yet. It isn't. But is this what it comes from to for you? So you don't have you raised your part and learned your lines, sir? Oh, so I have a B here. Exploiting tiny helpline B's. So in the previous B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. So you have to realize their parts to launch your answer. Was it blows on? I couldn't blow right now. This isn't a good fair. You told me why it doesn't some just step on this clip and we can all go home. In order to discord you are thinking like so order. I say it's Miss Lone. Please sit down. I think it was a awful nice of the bear fish like that. I think it's a jury. It's jury's on our side. We are doing everything right legally. I am florist. I'm a florist, right? Well, here is the great team. To a great team. Well, hello. Okay, hello. I did think you were coming. No, I was just late. But I tried to call Bart, the battery. I didn't want all those to go to us, so I called very luckily, and he was free. Oh, that was lucky. There a little lift. It could hit up. Yeah, that's it up surely whatever. So I or you're quite teens. Quite tense player. I am not much for the game myself. The ball is little gravelly and that's where I usually sit. right there, Canberra. I was looking at your resume and agree with me that eating with a chopstick isn't really a special skill. You think I don't see what you are doing. I know how hard it is to find the right job. We are having that in common, do we? Bees have 100 present employment. So bees are another bees. I think I don't have more. Not have too much. So I continue, and the base B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B's B B B's B B B B B B B's B B B's B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B. But we do jobs like taking out the cord out, and that's what I was thinking about doing. Can I let Barry blow your Roger for this pizza? I hope that will all right. I'm going to do drain the old stand. Yeah, you do that. Look at that. You know I have just about had it with your little mind games. What is Italian burger? Mamma mia! That's a lot of papers, a lot of ads. Remember what man said, why is your life more valuable than mine? Funny, I just can't seem to recall that. I think something is strange in there. I love the smell of the flowers. How do you like the smell of the flames? Not as much water bag, not taking that side. Can I am wearing a obsession with the head, and and this is pathetic. I have got issue. Well, a royal first you are burning. Am I surfing up? Dude, pour water. That bowl is generally exploded from those dirty yellow rings. Kenley, what are you doing? You know I don't even like honey. I don't eat it. We need to talk. He's just a little bee. So B. Bees, B, 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 bees, 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 B, 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 bees, B, 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 bees, bees, bee, bees, bee, bee. And he happens to be the nicest bee I have met in a long time. So again the bee. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B B bees B B B bees B beeps B B. Long time. What are you talking about? I Are there any bugs in your life? No, but there are another things bugging in my life, and you are one of them. Fine. Talking bees. No yogurt night. So again the bee. The last option is too big, I think. Why is taking so much time? So I'm reading the previous B, and bees, 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 B, bees, bees, B, bees, bees, B, bees, B, bean, B, B, bees, 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 B, 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 bees, B. So next we go to where we started. So no yogurt night, my neighbors. My nerves are fried from the riding on these emotional roller coasters. Goodbye, Kane. And from your information, I prefer sugar-free application. Sweet maids, my man. Oh, I'm feeling so much thirsty. Please, guys, do subscribe to my channel and show some support and keep me reading this thing. Goodbye, Ken. And for those information, I prefer to sugar-free artificial sweeteners made by man. I'm sorry about all that. I know it's got an artificial taste. I like it. Always feel there was some kind of barriers between skin and me. Between Kin and me, I couldn't overcome it. Oh well, are you okay for the trial? I believe Mr. Montgomery is about of our ideas. We would like to call Mr. Barry Benson. B to stand again the B. So B is B B is B is B B. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B's B B B B's B B B B B B's B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B's B's B B B's 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 B B's B's B and B B's B B's B B. It's a good idea. You can really see why she is considering one of the best lawyers. Yeah, Latin, you have gotten web some magic with his jury. It's gonna be all over. Don't worry. And the only things I have to do turn this jury around to them of what they don't like about bees. Second, the B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's 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 B B B B's B B's B B. Next I come on the below. You got the trousers. Are you allergenic? Only the losing son. Only to losing. Mr. Benson B. Again the B. B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B's B B B B B B B's B's B B's B B B B B. Oh, it's too hard to read all the B again from the starting. B's B's B B bees, bees, b, b, mm, b, bees, b, B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees 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 B B B B B B bees B B. How the I can get to the bottom again. I have so many to go again. What I think would I will like to know is what exactly is your relationship uh, to that woman. We are friends, good friends. Yes. How good do you live together? Wait a minute. Are you here? Literally bedbug. I have seen a bee documentary or two. So again the bee, and I got the bees, bee, bees, bees, bee, bees, bee. Bees, bee, 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 bee. My light will go off now. I think yes, already it did. So I need to. Sorry guys for this interrupt. Actually, and the light goes off here. So bees, bee, and bees, bee. It makes two bee, bees, bee, bees, 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 bee. From what I understand, doesn't your queen give a bride to all the bee children? Get another bee, and in the bottom I am getting maybe more bees here. Oh my god. I don't know how Mr. Beast finished it in those 2 hours. I'm really surprised on how to read this thing. B. Bees, 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 bee, bees, bee, bees, 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 bee, 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 bees, bee, 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 bees, bee, bee. Is the Mr. Beast? Let me check Mr. Beast reading B script, B movie script. Mr. B just finished this in 1 hour and 30 minutes. I really doubt how you can defeat all the bees and you can also read this in this shortest time. This is really surprising. I'm not sure how you get this one. Yeah, but those aren't your real parents. So, yeah, oh, Barry. Yes, they are. Hold me back. You are an illegal mess. B and aren't you the Benson? He is the dancer to bees. So another B. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Bees B B B B B B B B B B B B. B B B B B B bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B B bees B B bees bees B B B bees B bees bees B bees B bees B B. Okay. Aren't you Benson? He is the dancer bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B bees B B B bees 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 bees B bees B bees B. B and this B is B B. Don't you all date your cousin's objection? I'm going to penetration this guy Adam don't it's what he wants. Oh, I am hit. Oh Lord, I am hit. Orders this venom. The venom is consulting through my veins. This venom is consulting through my veins. I have been failed by winning the beast and destruction. You see, you can't treat them like equals. They are stripped average. It's turning the only things they know it's their way. Adam, stay with me. I can feel my legs. Now, what angle of mercy will come forward to the shock the poison from have been will I will be have ordered this court order please order the case honeybees versus the human race. I took the point turn against the bees. So again the bees and I need to read back. Oh, I think there is a big passage here that need to not be. So bees b b b b b b b b b b b b b bees b b b b b b b bees b b b bees b b b b b b b b b b b bees bees b bees b b b bees bees b bees b been three days b b b b b b b b b mm, b bees b b b b b b b b B B bees B B B B. Are you B enough? I don't think so. B and bees, bees, B, 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 bees, B, bees, B, B. It's going so long, man. I'm just fed up. How Mr. Beast can do this in 1 hour and 30 minutes? I'm really wondering how it's possible. Maybe I need 3 or 4 hours more. Yesterday, when one of their legal team started the layout on the Montgomery, hey, Bardi, hey, is there mass pain? Yeah, I blew the whole case. I didn't. I. It doesn't matter. What matters is you are alive. You could have died. I would be better off dead. Look at me. You got it from the cafeteria downstairs in a tuna sandwich. Look, there's a little celery still on it. What was it like to sting someone's? I can't explain it. It was all the adrenals of the uh, it's just alright. You think it was all a trap? Of course, I'm sorry. I flew us right onto this. What will the humans do to us if they win? I don't know. I heard they put the research in immortals. Doesn't sound so bad. Adam, they check in, but they don't check out. Oh my! Could you get a nurse to close that window? Why? The smoke. Bees don't smoke. So the court friends in favor of the bees. The court friends in favor of the bees. So and where is the line that I selected? Yes. Venus, we on. I know you could do it. High five. Sorry, I am okay. You are what the means. All the honey will finally belongs to the bees. Again, the bee. So bees Oof. Bees, bees, bee, bees, bees, bees. Where is the line? Now we won't have to work so hard for all the time, but this is the unboundedly the system. We balance the natural benson. We are regret this barrel how much honey is out there. All right, one at a time. Barry, who are you wearing, my sweater? And the revolution, I have been no pants. What if Montgomery writes, what do you? We have been living in this view way a long time, 17 million years. So we're living the 7b. So I'm going to read the b again. The b b b b b b b b B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. A long time, 70 million years. Congratulations on your victory. What will you demand as a settlement? First, we will demand a complete shutdown of all the bee work camps. First, we will demand a complete shutdown of all the bee work camps. Also, B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B bees B B B B bees B B B B bees B B. There's not too much. I think so. I'm about to finish this almost. Where is my line? Oh, here I am. Then we want back of the honey that was ours, being with every last drop. We demand all the glorification of the bears as anything more than a filthy smells, bad breeze, stink machines. We are not aware of they do in the woods. Wait for my signal. Take them out. He will have nerves for the few hours. Then he will be fine, and we will no longer tolerate be neglect nicknames. BB BB's B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B's B B B's B B B B B B B. But it is thus the parents about the system names. Unnecessary illustration of the honey is the bargain sales producer and la the humans tea time snack Gansman's can't bring it in boys. Bring it in boys. Hold it right there. Good, tap it. Mr. Buzoel, we just passed 3 cups and there's gallons more coming. I think we need to shut down. We have never shut down. Shut down honey production. Stop making honey. Turn your key, sir. What do we do now? Honorable. We are shutting honey production. Mission abroad. Mission abroad. Aborting pollination and nuclear deals returning to the base. Adam, you are one wonder believe how much honey has out there. Oh yeah, what's going on? Here's everybody. Are they out celebrating their home? They don't know what to do. Lying out, sleeping in. I heard that your uncle Oral was on his way, and the cricket. At least we got our honey back. Sometimes I think so. We humans like our honey. Why wouldn't we? It's the greatest things in the world. That excited me part of the month. And this was my new desk. And this was my new job. I wanted to do it really well, and now I care. I don't understand why you are not happy. I thought their lives would be better. They are doing the serious damaging really see people. You don't have idea what's going on. You do you? What did you want to show me this? What happened here? This is not the half of it. Oh no. Oh my, they're all waiting. Doesn't look very good, does it? No. And whose fault do you think that is? I am gonna goes blaze. Especially for me, I don't think bees are not to make honey affected. It's not just flower flux and they all need bees. And that's our the whole is a test right there and take away the production or affection of the center animal kingdom, and they of course of course the human person. So if there is no more no more pollutioning. If we could all just go as there, it could it. I know this is all his particular of my fault. How about the suicide practice? How do we do? This is all staying at your step on the on that just kill you the twice right of the listen to the berry. Sorry, I got going those have on my mouth and talk beans that why do you leaving? Why are you doing to the final tournament of the rose parody? Wait a minute, Rose. I can Rose parade in the person they are moved into the weekend because all the flowers are dying. It's the last chance I will be able to have to see it Venus. I just want to say sorry. I never mean this turn like this. I know me neither tournament of the roses. Rose can not do the sports. Wait a minute, roses, Venus roses, berry roses are flowers. Yes, they are flowers. It's pollen. I know that's why the last parrot maybe not. Could you ask them to slow down? Could you slow down? Barry, okay, I made a huge mistake. This is a total disaster of my fault. Yes, a kind of you and the plants. You wanted to help me with my flowers, so you made it actually the close down maybe. So I have another idea to get my previous ideas combined. I don't want to hear it. And alright, if they have those roses bell for the but I know every bees. So again the bees. I got to read this again. B B B B B bees bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees B bees B B B B B B B B B B B and flower birds in the parks all the got to be get the where we got and back where what we got bear park pollen flowers they production all across the nations tournament of the roses Patterson California but they have got nothing but flowers plots on the cotton candy security will be tight. I have an idea when I Plum FTT official plural business. It's real. Sorry, ma'am. Nice, bros. Thank you. It was a gift. Once inside, we just picked the right plot. How about the princess and the pea? I could be the princess, and you could be the pea. Yes, I got it. Where should I sit? What are you? I believe I am the pea. The pea. Oh my God, so pain playing here. And could you be the P? Yes, I got his. Where should I sit? What are you? I believe this is the P. This is this is gone under the mattress. No, this is the fairy tale. And sweetheart, I am going to get the marshals. You do that. This whole paradise is a fiction. Let us see what the baby will do. Hey, what are we doing? Then they all we do is blend in with traffic without absorbing the suspicion. Once at the airport, there is no stopping us. Stop security. You have to insert the back of your plot. Yes, has it been in your pension and their entire time? You and your insect pack is floating. Yes, has it been in your passion the entire time? Would you be remove these shoes, remove your standard? It's a part of me. I know. That's just having some fun to enjoy your flight. Then, if we are lucky, we have just enough pollen to do the job. Can you believe how lucky you are? We have just enough pollen to do this job. I think this gonna be work. It's got to work. Attention, passenger. This is the Captain Scott. We have been a bit bad weather in New York. It looks like we will experience a couple hours delay. Barry, with those flat flowers with no water, they will never make it. I got up three and talked to them. Be careful. Can I get help with the Scramble magazine? I would like to order the taking. Inflatable nose and ears hair trimmer. Captain, I am the real situation. What you say, Hall? Nothing. B. So I got B again. Can I need to get this? 1 second more. B. 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 B, B. Don't freak out, my entire species. What are you doing? Wait a minute. I'm an attorney. Who's an attorney? Don't move. Oh, very good afternoon, passengers. This is our captain. We would miss Venice's Bloom at the 24B. Please report to the cockpit and please hurry. What happens here? There was a dust buster dropped by a little rough exploding. One bladder once aboard. They are both unconscious. Is that another B joke? No. So I got another B. Some B. I can read it like this. Some B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Okay. So how did I finish this time? No, not up the top. Oh, this is here. So don't freak out. So don't freak out, my entire space. What are you doing? Maybe like this. Low jump. Big plane. Oh yes, I just did this. There is a B on the plane. Just a minute, there is a B on the place. I am quite familiar with the Mr. Benson, and he is no account competitors. And those have been done enough damage. Oh yes. Technically, we should be able to fly at all, fly at all. So I need to read the B again here from here, like this one. This B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B. Okay, there's no closed. Not this here. So technically B here I just missed. So shouldn't be able to fly at all. Their wings are too small. Haven't we heard this a million times? The surface are for the wings and the body mass are make no sense. Get this on the air. Got in the car, got it standby. We are going to live. The way we work may be mystery to you. Making honey takes a lot of doing a lot of small jobs, but let me tell you about a small job. If you do well to make a big difference, more than we realize to us to everyone. That's why I want to get bees back to work together, and that's the bee way. So again the bee. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Okay. Yeah, not made of the jello. We have got behind a flow, black and yellow. Hello, left, right, down. However, forget however. This isn't so hard. Beep, 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 beep. Barry, what happened? Wait. I think we are an autopilot the whole time. That may have been helping me, and now we are not. So I turns out I cannot fly a plane. All of you, let's get behind the floor and move it out. Move out. We are only chance if I do what I would do on copy me with the wings of the planes. Don't have to yell. I am not yelling. Uh, we are in a lot of trouble. It's very hard to concentrate with that banking tone of your voice. I have very concentrate. It's very hard and concentrate with that the banking tones of your voice. It is not tones of I'm banking. I can't do this. Manage pull yourself together. You have to snap out of it. You 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 snap out of it, you snap out of it, you snap out of it, you snap out of it. Hold it. Why? Oh, come on, it's my turn. How, please? How is the plane flying? I don't know. Hello, Benson. We got any flowers? Some are for a happy occasion there. The pollen jacks, they do get behind a pillow. Black and yellow. Hello. Alright, let's drop the tin can the back top where I can see anything. Can you? Alright, let's drop the tin can and back top and while I can see anything. Can you? Nothing, it's all cloudy. Come on, you got thing to be. So many bees. Almost finished, just a little bit. I'm so tired. Now again the bee. So B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Okay. This B now this time. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Okay. Thinking B, this B. Now B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. B B B B B B B B B B B B. Okay. What is the tomato track and get some lights on that so the B B B B B B B B B B B B B B and B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Now the thinking B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Okay. The thinking B last B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Princess, M for the flowers. Okay, out of the engineers, we are going to on B power. Ready, boys? Now we are B. We got this B. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Okay. Affirmative. Good, good, easy now. That's it. Land on the flowers. Ready? Full reverse. Full reverse. Spin it around. Not that flowers. The other one. Which one? That flowers. I am aiming at the flowers. Yeah, that's a fat guy in the flower shirt. I mean the giant pulsing flower made of the millions of the bees. Bird forward, nose down, tails up, rotate around it. This is the instant worry. This is only the way know how to fly. Am I Coco or this plane flying at an instant like the parrot? And get get your nose in there. Don't be afraid. Smell it. Full reverse. Just drop it to be part of it. For the for the center. Now drop it in. Oh man, come on already, Barry. We did it. We taught me how to fly. Yes, now high five. Right, Barry. It worked. Did you see the giant flowers? The what giant flowers? Where of course I saw the flower. That was genius. Thank you. But we are not done yet. Listen, everyone. This runway is convert with the last pollen from the last flowers available anywhere in on earth. That means this is our last chance. We are the only ones who make sunny pollinate flowers and dress like this. If we are gonna survive as the species, this is our moment. Or what do you say? Are we going to be outside of the museum, national historical concern? We are bees. Kitchen the floor, me accept the concern. Hold on, Barry, sir. We have been earned this. Yeah, I am Poland, Jack, and this is the perfect fit. All I got to do are the shelves. Oh yeah, that's our bird, mom. The bees are back. If anybody needs to make call, now is the time. I got feeling we have been working late tonight. Here's the sense we have a great afternoon. Can I help? Who's next? Would you like to some honey too? With that, it's been approved. Be approved. Don't forget those. I'm gonna get B. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B's B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. Milk cream and sauce all me, and I don't see the nickel. Sometimes I just feel like a piece of meat, like a piece of meat. I had no idea, but I'm sorry. Have you got the moment? Would you excuse me? My mosquito has said to it will help you. Sorry, I am late. He is a lawyer too. I was already your boom suck parasite. All I need was the briefcase. Have you have a great afternoon. but I just got this huge tulip order and I cannot get them anywhere. No problem, Belt. I just leave it to me. You are a lifesaver, Barry. Can I help? Can I help? Who's next? All right. Scramble jokes. It's time to fly. Thank you, Barry. And that's B is living my life. So I can let it go anywhere. When do will this nightmare end? Let it all go. Beautiful day to fly. Sure, it between you and me, I was dying to get out of that office. You have got to start thinking, B, my friend. Sorry, the B. Oh, I am on the in, guys. I just finally going to make this. I cannot believe I just did it. I am going to did this. Not just did it. I am going to almost these few lines and the B two B's remaining and just did B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. As you can listen to my voice, this is really going too much bad. But I am almost about to finish this and last only one B remaining. My friend thinking B, and this is the last B to repeat. For me, I'm just going to break the record that only got by Mr. Beast. And so it is B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B. My voice is not coming out yet. B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B bees 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 B B bees bees B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B B, and that's the last line I need to read. Me, hold it. Let's start the stop for a second. Hold it. I'm sorry, everyone. Can we stop here? I'm not making the major life decision during the production number. Alright, take 10. Everybody warp it up, guys. I had virtually no rehearsal for this. Special thanks to Sarasake. And that is, guys, thank you guys to be with me, and all the B movie script has just been finished. This is a huge. Thank you guys watching my video. If you like this, please do share this. And I am signing out from this live now. It's been a long time to be on this live. So bye bye. See you. And I am going to break more records by Mr. Beast in the upcoming days. So do support me. And Mr. Beast, I am a big follower of yours. So don't take me wrong, and I am just